Mark is the principal facilitator for Investigations Differently. As I said, he has done a couple of webinars last year and they were enormously popular, and there's quite a lot of people today for this one. Mark has extensive experience in assessing risk, which commenced as a federal agent in the Australian Federal Police, responsible for assessing risk while investigating organised crime and large-scale drug and fraud offences. He has more than 20 years experience in Australia and overseas for a diverse range of organisations, including BHP, Rio Tinto, Tees Australia, Lutheran Services, the Mayfield Group, CR McMahon Holdings, Urban Utilities, Powerlink, and Mitchell Services. And I'm sure the list goes on and on. Over to you. Thanks for joining us, Mark.
Okay. I've got to, oh, that's a terrible bio. I've got to do something about that.
All right, I'll mute myself and you can carry on here.
No worries. Yeah, well, firstly, thanks, Marsh, and thank you everyone for coming along today. I know everyone's time's valuable and I appreciate it. So let's get into it. This sort of came about because I was working with some clients, and we realised that there was a real need to give some capacity, some capability to our managers in operations, particularly about, well, they get a risk assessment, they ask for risk assessment, well, what next? What are they meant to do with it? What are they meant to look for? And we don't really provide a lot of guidance. So today's session's really for either people that are in those management positions themselves that look at risk assessments and assess risk assessments, for want of a better term, or for people in the safety profession who are trying to upskill their managers so they know what good looks for. So let's get into it. So why do I want to talk about managers? And the main reason I want to talk about managers is because there's, we all know there's legal obligations for in Australia, especially under the model safety legislation, PCBUs and all that sort of stuff, about managing risk. And for those that are interested, the report about Dreamworld and all the issues about managing risk there, it makes for interesting reading. I wouldn't say I'm 100% aligned with the outcomes of that report. However, it does point out that managers have real obligations in managing risk. So there is some legal obligations there. That's number one. We all know that. It's an ethical responsibility, and I have yet to meet a manager that doesn't want their workers to be safe, doesn't care for their workers. They want their workers to be safe. So we have that ethical responsibility to make sure we try and provide as much protection as we can for our workers who, by and large, sometimes do extremely risky tasks. The two main reasons we've got, as managers, we've got this responsibility is because at the end of the day, it's money, right? We control the resources, we control the budgets. So if a manager controls the budgets, what money gets spent where, what tech gets put in, what tech doesn't get put in, what controls get put in, what controls don't get put in place, that's like the ultimate responsibility, right? Because there's no free ride here. Every single thing we do costs us in some form, whether it's a lost opportunity, whether it's a lost resource, whether it's a person that's not able to do a job that they would have otherwise been doing. It all costs money, and management make that decision about budget and resources. So they are the ultimate authority, right? They are the decision makers, which is why I wanted to do that. Now, there was a when I posted about this today's session on LinkedIn, I had someone commented that managers don't approve risk assessments, they just exist. Well, I think you do. No, I just sort of fundamentally disagree with that notion. And even that tacit acceptance, right? So even if you don't formally sign off, so one of my mates was talking about, formal sign off of a risk or something like that. Even if you don't formally sign it, if you get a risk assessment, ask for risk assessment, and then that's it, you've formally approved it in a way, right? So that is acceptance of the risk. You're accepting the residual risk. You're accepting the risk assessment for what it is, as a version of the truth, and that you're happy to proceed with the whatever work or whatever project, whatever your risk assessing is done. Now, like there's 1,000 risk assessments out there, and not all of them go through to a manager. You know, like typical like personal risk, take fives, for instance. JHAs probably wouldn't do. So, but you know, sometimes we have those other ones. Today's session is more around a qualitative risk assessment. You know, those typical RAC type things. But it sort of fits, everything sort of fits within it. But there is a session that's there's a little section in here today that's more to do with the semi-quantitative stuff. But at the end of the day, the principles are still the same about what we're going to go through today. So the main question I have for the group, and it's going to be hard because this is not really easy feedback, but feel free to put them in the comments there, is why do we assess risk, right? Why do we assess risk? And too often, more than not, and there'll be 1,000 answers there, and people have a different reason for anything, but one of the most common things we see is to justify a decision that's already been made. You know, we're going to go ahead and dig that hole, or we're going to go ahead and do the task this way. Safety person, go do a risk assessment, or manager, go get a risk assessment organised because that's the decision we've made. One of the issues we have with that is that we haven't considered all the uncertainty. We haven't considered the other ways that we might be able to do that role, that task, through that risk assessment process. We've already made the decision. So our assumptions are already there. Our bias is already there. And too often or not, we will, and I've seen it far too often, where we will flavour the risk assessment, and we'll talk about the risk matrix a little bit later, to give us a positive result because we want to go ahead with the job. A classic example of that, I see it so many times, is a JHA, or say a SWIMS, right? Where, or, you know, THA, whatever you want to call them, that next level up from a personal take 5, a personal risk assessment. And those, particularly those ones which have a scoring mechanism. I think I've seen one in my career where they've said, no, we can't proceed with the job, it's too risky. Every other time they'll run that scoring to give them permission to go ahead with the task. And I'm sure, you know, if you want to yell out and in the chat room or whatever, I'm sure that's common. I'm sure you've seen that. So that's a real risk in justifying a decision that's already been made. But really, the purpose of risk assessments is to identify and control unknown risks. So, and I've talked before, and I talk again, and I talk in other sessions about, you know, why do we assess unknown risks? Why are we on that merit? Why do we assess known risks? Why do we keep reassessing the same thing time and time again, when really we should be focusing on those unknown risks? Because that's what we want to control, right? We want to identify those. We need to identify, assess, and control those unknown risks. And too often that doesn't happen. So as a manager, ask, what don't we know? What's the risk we haven't considered? So at the end of the day, what does a manager ultimately want out of good risk assessments? What do they ultimately want? You want accurate information. You know, you need accurate information. It needs to be credible. It needs to be realistic. It needs to truly reflect the work that's done and the conditions of work, the constraints and the context of work. And we're going to talk about that. If it doesn't do that, then it's that work is imagined and it's no good to us. It's not accurate, right? Because it's not the real world. Because at the end of the day, we need, from a risk assessment, you need to you need to understand the risk, because that's one of the things that's a requirement as a duty holder, is understanding risk, because you need to manage the risk. If you don't understand it, so you can see how this leads. If we don't have accurate information, we won't understand it, we can't manage it, and therefore we make poor decisions if we don't have that. Because at the end of the day, we want to make good decisions, right? We want to make the best decision, and we need good information to do that. That's what we need. So, because at the end of the day, what I think a good risk assessment does, and I'm talking about the process, I'm not talking about the bloody piece of paper or the bow tie or the thing that goes in your computer system or whatever it is. What I want out of a risk assessment is that I learn enough that we can create and implement effective controls that either eliminate the risk or reduce the risk to as low as reasonably practicable or to a tolerable level, and that also allow people to fail safely, right? If we're relying on a piece of paper to keep our people safe, if we're relying on them not to make an error, and that's it, that's our line of defense, it's a brittle system. They're brittle controls, right? So as a manager, I want the best controls that we can, that we can reasonably practically put in, right? And that's what it's about. But to do that, I've got to have the right information, right? If I don't have the right information, how do I make that decision? How do I make that judgment? So, because at the end, when we get into it, it's not about freedom from risk, right? So there's a lot of talk, and you can see all the arguments from zero harm and that zero harm's a realistic thing. But even those organisations I've seen that promote zero harm as an achievable result still do not have zero residual risk on their risk registers. They don't. It's impossible, because you'd have to eliminate the work, right? To eliminate all the risk. So it's about that tolerance. So it's about getting that level of risk to a tolerable level and making sure people are competent in managing it, right? And accepting that risk, right? So it's accepting that level of tolerance that we need, and that our people have some competence in controlling it. And when I talk about that, it's the people who are doing the work, right? They understand, they identify the risk, the controls in place, the organisation has set them up for success, and to the point where they wouldn't even, almost don't have to think about it, right? Because the organisation systems are robust, that if they make a mistake or forget something, they're protected. So this is out of a British paper, and I can get that out to everyone if they want it, back in about 2003, I think. And these are some of the common pitfalls. I listed about 20. It was a case study out of Britain, and it looked at rail, it looked at a few other things as well. And these are some of the common pitfalls. We've already talked about the first one, using a risk assessment to attempt to justify a decision that's already been made. We've talked about that. We're going to go into a bit more detail about the next one, that lacking of detail and context. And we'll go through some of these in some more detail as we go through. Not involving people who do the work in the risk assessment. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen risk assessments and I look at who has attended the risk assessment, and it's a safety person and a supervisor, or a safety person by themselves, or one worker, or a foreman or a supervisor, superintendent. Just not involving the people. We'll talk about why we need them there. Risk scenarios really poorly written and lacking that detail you're really required to get context and assess the risk sufficiently, right? Generic risk assessments. Oh, we've got a site risk assessment for something that's occurring at location A. Oh, we'll just be able to copy and paste that and do that at location B, and ignoring that local rationality. I work with clients who have depots that are in the middle of say Adelaide or Brisbane, and then those same clients then have depots like say in South Australia that are based out at Port Augusta, or more remote areas in Port Augusta. They don't have the same availability of backup controls, support, or anything like that. So trying to say that they're the same when they're not the same, and that's a real issue. We'll talk about controls lacking detail. The misapplication of assessment evaluation. I did put something on LinkedIn yesterday, and it's trending fairly heavily. This is common. I don't know how many times. If I sit in another room and hear an argument about likelihood and consequence, I think I'd be sick. Risk assessments that are focused about the output. They're focused about like the piece of paper. I've worked with companies that have had risk assessment templates that are 30, 40 columns wide. Like, what? It makes no sense. And it all gets caught up in the format and the template and the output. And we see this thing with bow ties. Oh, that's not it. There's some real misunderstanding, misapplication about when we focus on that, when really the focus should be on generating context and generating, genuine inquiry and learning. and often, obviously, the wrong risk assessment tool. There's so many risk assessment tools out there now that are purpose-built. If you're looking at fatigue, don't use a general, workplace risk assessment and control template. Get hold of a really good fatigue risk assessment. Another really good one is manual handling, right? So hazardous manual tasks. So in the framework, we're meant to risk assess hazard manual tasks these days. Well, the university, I think it was the University of Queensland in association with the state government of Queensland, he developed, I think it's called Perform. And it's a really task, it's really focused risk assessment, which is just based on hazardous manual task. So too often I see the wrong tools used, which we get these generic results, which really aren't worth the time or paper effort they were used to develop. So let's have a look at context. You've heard me mention context a few times. I really like this picture here. You look at those individuals and they see their little bit, but no one sees the overall thing. And work is a complex task. Work of any sort of task is complex by its nature, right? We think about, say, a forklift loading a truck. Well, that sounds simple. But then when you actually break it down and you go, okay, the forklift, well, then we have to select the right forklift, right? How do we select the right forklift? Has it got to be high vis? Has it got to be, what are the hazards and risks around a forklift? Then we've got to set the operator, and the operator's training on the forklift and licensing. The area which the unloading of the truck happens, is it level? Is it flat? What are the hazards and risks around that? The truck itself. Is it the forklift capable of unloading the truck? The load on the truck. So actually, when we start to break that down, a simple matter of unloading a truck with a forklift actually breaks down in quite a complex series of tasks, and a lot of things could affect the outcome of the success of that task of unloading the truck. And we can't understand that unless we understand the context. And unloading a truck in one place might be quite simple. Unloading a truck somewhere else could be quite difficult. So it's that context of that matters. So this slide here comes from Conklin, from his book Pre-Accident Investigations. If you haven't read it, I think he's got it on Amazon. You can download it there, and it's a very cool book, and it talks about. It's basically what it says: it's pre-accident investigation, but it's about investigating work before there's a dynamic failure, right? Before there's a dynamic consequence. So Conklin talks about these three parts of failure: the contents, the consequence, and the retrospective understanding. For the purposes of risk assessments, the retrospective understanding is really not that important. It's actually not that important for investigations either, but we can have that discussion another day. The two things we need to really sort out are the context, and the consequence. So, and we'll talk about that as we go forward now. So let's have a look about how work's done. So for those of you that have read some of Conklin's work, we talk about the black line and the blue line. I haven't put the black line up here because that's just work as imagined or work as intended. That's our procedures and policies. I'm more interested in what we call the blue line, which is how work gets done, right? So every day you go to work and things happen, impact on how you do your work, right? So, we'll have, and sometimes those conditions make us interact with a hazard more closely than we like, and sometimes impact with a hazard. And these things can be all these different types of things. So there can be, a human error, for example, change in plans. How often do you go to work on a Monday and it not survive opening your emails if you haven't checked them over the weekend? I talk to supervisors all the time, and one of the things I say to them, what do you do? What do you do all day? I put out fires, change in plans, something goes wrong, I have to fix it. All these things keep coming up. Their day, they could plan their day, and they might plan their day for going off for a training course or something like that. But typically, you couldn't plan a supervisor's day. You can give them a rough guideline, and there might be a list of jobs they have to achieve. Whether they get them done and how will they do them will depend on everything else that comes up during the day. And it happens with workers too. You think about a crew that's got to go, say, fix a burst water main. Depends on the location, the street, how busy it is, how much public's there. What if someone's called in sick? What if the machine breaks down they're using, the digger? What if there's all sorts of things could affect it. There's a production pressure, have to get that water line fixed in time. All these things affect And that's what we call the context, right? The conditions and systems of work that they work in, and they all impact on risk. They all impact on the likelihood and the consequence and the chances and the probability of there being some sort of event. Now, unless we learn about that in our risk assessment from the people doing that work, then how do we know what our true risk is, right? How do we know what's credible? And we won't know that unless we talk to them. So how do we learn about context? And I've just given it, visit the field. I've seen too many risk assessments completed from someone's desk, right, without actually going into the field. Another way to do it is to do a work task simulation. Walk through it. Get the people in the place where the task is going to be done and step by step walk through it without actually doing it. You'd be amazed at how much that helps with planning, and you'd be amazed at how much it helps with learning about context. The other thing is, if all you uncover is known risk, well, you don't have to reassess those. You just check your controls, right? And if you're not sure about that, look at the code of practice. It's in the code of practice. Have a look at that. We need to involve the people we do the work. Brainstorming is my favorite technique in risk assessments, and that's something we teach in our masterclass. Learning teams, another great way about learning about how work is done, learning that context. Can't recommend them highly enough. Learning teams are really cool. Get them done. I think Southpack International runs a course on that. So in other words, we've got to talk to the people that do the work, right? I know this for most of you, I'd say 99.9% of you, you're saying, yes, we know this is obvious, right? But how often have you seen it not being done, right? How often are managers accepting risk assessments if they've got people that are attended, participant lists, with not the right people in the room? Now, I don't care if you were a supervisor, you were on the tools yesterday and a supervisor today. Get the person who's on the tools today, not you. You've got a different context now. You've got a different bias. Your issues will be different. Just because you did the job, a week ago, a year ago, 2 years ago, doesn't mean you know how it affects people now, right? Get the right people in the room. They're the only ones that know the context and can actually give you credible risk scenarios, right? Only people who can. So you've heard me talk about scenarios and credible risk scenarios. So one of the things we know is that risk is not static, right? An example of that is driving a car. So if I'm parked in my driveway or in the car park of my work, and I'm sitting there, engine's running, and I'm about to leave, what's my risk? Pretty low, right? However you measure it, it's pretty low while I'm sitting there in the car park. But then if I drive out of the car park, it starts to go up, right? And then if I'm driving in the city and it's 60, it's there. What if I get onto the freeway at 100? What if I'm on a country road at night and it's raining? So we know that risk is variable, but it's really hard to demonstrate on a static single piece of paper at one single point in time that variability. You can't do it, right? So you could, but imagine the risk register to be immensely long. So what we do is we talk about this credible worst case scenario, right? That's what we talk about. So for a risk to become a risk, for a hazard to become a risk, right, there has to be that interaction. And this room's too smart for me to go, to knows this too much. Like, we're not going to go into the PowerPoint thing. But we have to have that interaction, right? And to assess it and put it on in some sort of output that's useful, we talk about worst case. Well, I talk about worst case of credible scenarios. I like to thank Ben out of PowerLink for that. And he gave me that one. I like it. It's a different way of saying worst case, credible scenario. It's worst case of credible scenarios. So that's what we talk about. So it gives us that maximum thing. So it's in risk, we're always lean on the conservative side. So if we're unsure if something's at one level or the other, we always put it to the next level. So we're conservative. We can demonstrate that we've taken a conservative approach to risk, which means we're looking at it from a higher level, right? So what does that mean? What's worst case of credible scenarios? So look, these are just dictionary definitions and everyone can read. I'll leave this up for a second. So credible, it's got to be believed, right? It's got to be plausible, right? We've got to think like it's true. It's got to be reasonable, right? And that's where quite often we have these discussions. And this is where having the right people in the room is essential, because we will not get any of those three things if we don't have them in the room, right? Now, that doesn't mean we don't have some subject matter experts in. That doesn't mean we don't look at the information outside of that group. So we might be risk assessing, say, loading that truck with a forklift, unloading a truck, or loading a truck with a forklift, right? So we want a truck operator in there, a forklift operator in there. Maybe if it's a yard, someone who runs the yard, like someone who works in the yard, we'd have those people in the room. We also might have like the safety person in the room as a participant, because they've looked at forklift incidents within the company, within the industry, within other industries, and that also gives us a little bit of data. That's why they're called semi-qualitative, because there's a little bit of data in there, right? But it's subjective, still subjective, right? So we get them in, but we've got to be reasonable, right? And we can only discover that in our context. We can only discover that if they're reasonable, if we can do it, right? Because too often I've seen us go down this path of too many what ifs. And I really see this happen with incident classification. And I think I've mentioned this in a previous webinar, where we go, well, hang on, someone could have been walking through there. What if this happens? What if that happens? Don't spend too much time on the what ifs. If they're not credible, if the interaction isn't credible, the interaction isn't credible with the people doing the work in the context of where the work's occurring, chances are it's not credible. So don't spend too much time on it, right? Look at the credible stuff, right? That's what we want you to do. So this is a bit of 101. Now, some may have seen this sort of stuff before. I'm not saying this is the best way. I'm not saying this is the only way, but this is how I write a risk scenario, and I've found it works for me. And thanks to Margot, who taught me this a long time ago, about developing risk scenarios, and I've modified it a bit. But we need a hazard, right? So this is a little formula that helps. So if you're a manager looking, it needs to have these 4 ingredients, regardless how the risk scenario is written. The risk assessment needs to have these 4 ingredients for it to work, right? So we need a hazard. We need some sort of interaction, right? How the target, which is a personal thing, and we'll just stick to people because we've got a safety focus on this one today. How does that person get hit by the hazard, right? How does it get damaged? What's the impact? How does it impact, right? And we need a consequence. And the reason we need that consequence is because we need to assess the risk, right? We need to work out, we need to prioritize, because the consequence helps us prioritize. And we'll talk about that right towards the end today. So there must be that hazard, there must be that interaction, right? The potential for interaction for it to be a risk. And that's 101. So sorry if I'm, telling you to suck eggs proverbially there, but I just want to, some managers don't know this. It's important for managers to know these important ingredients must be there. And look, this is a real simple one. So we've got a worker, so that's our target. Interaction, falls while climbing, the hazard's a ladder. So again, it's wordsmithing. You could word this different ways, however you want, but the ingredients still need to be there, right? And in this case, I've just said medical treatment. That could be a fatality. If the ladder is a 10, is a 6 meter ladder or whatever, well, then that could be fatality, right? Or some would argue that at 2 meters or less than 2 meters, it could be a fatality. It could be credible, but you've got to take it in the context and the people that do the work, right? So if you put it together in wordsmith, a worker falls while climbing a ladder, resulting in a medical treatment. So we've got our target, the worker, we've got our interaction, we've got our hazard, right? And we've got our consequence. And that really helps. If you write it this way, when you go to do the risk assessment, particularly if you're using some sort of risk matrix, which the majority of organizations are, and that's a whole other discussion, right? You need to know the consequence. So why not wrap it up into your scenario? Because it's really important, and this will show why we need it in a minute. So the consequence. Now, too often I see consequences not poorly defined. So this is just a snapshot at the top here of the slide, is a snapshot of, say, the descriptors of a risk matrix. So you'll have your likelihood descriptors and you'll have your consequence descriptors. And this one, it's people, could be health and safety, property, reputation, community, so forth, right? Environment. I see too often where they're not really defined that well. Now, we don't want to over-define. We don't want to put, falls down a ladder, breaks a leg, because that doesn't, or breaks a limb, because that doesn't, we'd have, 15,000 lines on a risk register if that's what we're doing. What we want is to try and link it. The easiest way to do this, if you're facilitating these things, link it back to your risk descriptors, your consequence descriptors within your risk process, right? So don't just accept injury. Look for where it says, okay, what sort of injury would it have? Well, if someone fell off a ladder, chances are the most credible thing is they might, say it's say it's a step stool, right? Might be a restricted work injury. They might roll an ankle, have a restricted work injury. That's a conversation that goes in the context with the people doing the work. It might be a lost time injury, right? Yeah, they could end up with a couple of days off. That's probably more credible. So don't just put injury, put lost time injury. And for those that are jumping ahead, you'll notice we've already started to think, okay, well, hang on, that'll line up with our matrix, right? Which is what we want to do. Don't just say damage. How much damage, right? So, because it's important, because when you go to assess the risk within your risk matrix, if that's what you're doing, it's important to be specific. Don't just say harmed reputation. What sort of harm? How far are we going? We're talking current affair, knocking on people's doors? We're talking about a mention in Parliament? Or are we talking just the local rag has decided to write something up and say, hang on, you guys are nasty, right? What's the risk? Because that'll determine what's the consequence, because that'll help us prioritize how much effort we put in our controls, yeah? Makes sense. So we saw that simple risk scenario. Look, if we did that for everything, we get in it with some of those risk registers, and I'm sure people are still doing them, and you've probably got them, some of your workplaces now, 700, 800 line items long. What we're tending to do now is look for these complex risk scenarios, right? We'll wrap up everything into one sort of risk scenario. And this leads to things like bow tie, right? And bow tie works the same. It still has the same ingredients, right? We still have a hazard. Which here, the hazard is the vehicle, right? We still have an interaction hitting a pedestrian, right? We still have the target, the pedestrian, and we still have the consequence, right? The fatality. So the interaction is impacting a pedestrian due to lack of visibility. That's our interaction. The next one, impacting a pedestrian due to poor lighting, right? So this is just an example, right? Please don't get wrapped up in how I've written it. But these are an example of how we can write a complex risk scenario. It's about how you write it, but they still have the same 4 ingredients. And it doesn't matter what sort of risk scenario you're writing, they still have it. It doesn't matter what tool you're using, you still need these 4 sort of things. How you wordsmith, it's up to you. It's just got to make sense to the people that are doing it. So I've talked about failing safely. Allow people to fail safely. What do I mean by that? Well, I tow a trailer, a couple of different trailers around. I've got a little tinny. I should say my wife has a tinny and I tow it around for her. I've got just a standard box trailer that I use for a bit of rubbish and other bits and bobs. And every time I put that trailer on, I put a safety chain on. And also, you can't really see it there. I put the little locking pin in to hold the handle of the hitch down, to lock it in place. Why do I do that? Why do I put the safety chain on? Well, I put the safety chain on in case I forgot to put the locking pin on the hitch, in the case that the hitch fails, right? And hopefully, I'll do less damage. I'll mitigate the damage. I'll mitigate the chances of a runaway trailer. I'll reduce the likelihood of a runaway trailer causing some damage. In other words, I'm trying to allow myself to fail safely, right? And that's what we're after. We're trying to fail safely. So that's the question managers should be asking. Do the controls allow us to fail safely? If one of our people makes an error, what saves their life next? right? What stops them from getting seriously hurt? What stops the harm from an error? That's what we want to know. That's the question we want to know. So when we're looking at controls, that's your first question, right? Your second question, your second thing is have a look at them. And again, it gets the same as the consequence, right? Being specific on your controls. Honestly, it's the same thing again. If I see PPE inspections, maintenance, exclusion lane, training, supervision, take 5, it's like a little laundry list of generic controls which mean nothing, Risk assessments are meant to be some of a foundation record, right? We're meant to use that to develop good work as intended. We're meant to use them to be specific about what we want our people to do in a certain situation. Now, if we're not specific in the risk assessment, between the risk assessment, right, and the procedure, who's making that up, right? Let's be specific, right? So if you've got a task that requires a specific rated glove, put that in. If you've got an inspection that's meant to be done by a geotechnical engineer on a certain frequency to a certain standard, put that in. Maintenance, no, we want better than that. Looking at steering, like say a couple of critical controls, arguably, for driving, right? Steering and brakes. If you can't steer it, you can't stop it. We're in a bit of trouble, right? What are critical controls around that? What do we need to see about our steering and brakes? How often do they have to inspect it? How much free play are we allowing in our steering? What do our brakes got to be? Are they wet or dry? How often have we got to inspect them? When do we place the pads? Are we running to failure? We've got a preventative maintenance strategy, which means we replace them when they get to a certain gap size, right? Exclusion zones. What do we mean by that? How far, right? How far do we? What do we judge the drop zone of a crane, right? So I haven't written it a little bit more in there, but if I was writing exclusion zone for a crane, I'd be saying we want hard barricading to this standard at a minimum distance of 1.5 times the length of the boom that the crane will be operating on, or something like that, right? You have to judge that with the people depending on the type of load, right? So be specific. Don't accept generic. If you want to, and we teach this in our masterclass, you can put generic controls in the scope of your risk assessment. So we consider these as generic. We want the specific, and that is, we're driving towards the specific risk. We're linking these specific controls to the specific risk. And that's what you want to see as a manager, that link. Question them, right? Make sure we're just not relying on how we've always done it, right? Go back and say, well, what else can we do? Right? Don't just say, oh yeah, they've done the risk assessment, tick box, my bum's covered. No, isn't enough. Conklin says this, isn't enough. He asks that all the time. Ask, is it enough? Right? Is that the best we can do? And wait and see what they come back with. You might be surprised. Ask them, is that the best you can do with the controls? What else you got? Find out. Get some options. Right? When we come to control design, this comes from the ICMM, the International Council of Mining and Metals. It's really cool. There's 2 good booklets here. Critical Control Management Good Practice Guide, Critical Control Management Implementation Guide. They cross over a bit, but they actually talk about control design and implementing critical control management. So when we're looking at really designing our controls properly, I can't recommend enough that you read these. MIOSH's risk assessment module update that's coming out soon will have these, the ability to be able to put use the format from ICMM in that module. So that'll help. And there's some more to come from MIOSH in regards to verification of controls and making that easy. So just a note for managers, if you want to have an idea about some good risk management, especially those critical controls, critical risk management, have a look at those 2. You can go to their website, you can download them free, and highly recommend that you have a look at those. So we're just going to move on. I know we've got a few minutes left. I want to leave some time for questions and answers. So assessment evaluation, this is the common trap I see, and don't accept it as a manager. It's the likelihood of the consequence occurring as a result of the specific interaction with that hazard, right? It's not just the likelihood of the interaction or of the hazard, right? It's got a result of all three. It's got to have the interaction with the hazard, with the target, and result in that consequence. It's the likelihood of that. So we take our falling down the ladder thing, right? So it's the likelihood of someone falling down the ladder and having a medical treated injury. It's the likelihood of that, right? It's not the likelihood of someone just falling down the ladder. So a common one I see is someone walking across like a car park or along, just walking, people will go, oh, well, people walk all the time, right? So the likelihood is high. Well, no, it's the likelihood of that person walking along that path, falling over and resulting in the damage that they get. So, it's the likelihood of, and so we say that damage is credible, he might be a lost time injury. It's the likelihood of that. And then it reduces our likelihood 9 times out of 10, right? If we read it like that. That is how we assess risk. That's straight out of the ISO. That's in the code of practice. That's how it works, right? It's the likelihood of the consequence occurring as a result of the specific thing. So make sure they just haven't assessed it based on the likelihood of the interaction or the likelihood of the hazard. It's got to result in that consequence, which is why we want that consequence there. It makes it so much easier to assess risk, right? It's got to be credible. I've talked about that a couple of times, right? Be careful of the trap of undervaluation. I talked about that earlier before about people who will score a risk assessment to get the job done, right? Well, got to do it. So no, just lower that. We've seen that all there, right? Make sure control. So if you've got, I'm not a big fan of just assessing inherent risk. I don't see the value, and that we can have a discussion on that at some stage. But after you've got your current controls in, if you've got additional controls and you're looking and you say, oh, hang on, they're going to do this. If they do anything but adjust the likelihood, question them, because the scenario already has a built-in consequence. So unless they're eliminating the risk, right, or eliminating the hazard or really curtailing it, chances are we're playing with figures, right? Now, I'm not saying that doesn't, like seatbelts, we know reduce consequence, right? We know that, right? But that's already, unless you've got, what car doesn't have a seatbelt? So there'll be the rare occasion where we'll have a mitigating control, which will actually reduce consequence, right? But if we don't already have that mitigating control in, and that's an additional control, then yes, that might be something where we can reduce consequence, but it's rare. So be very careful. 9 times out of 10, your additional controls will only affect the likelihood, and barely, if anything, because you'll find most of the times under your existing controls, because we're already really assessing known risks, we'll be still floating around, unlikely, rare, possible, very rare to go outside of those. Managers, you might get a heap of risk assessment. They're quite large. Prioritize, right? Look for those risks with critical life-altering consequences. Where could someone get killed? Look at those ones, right? Look at, that's the thing we want to ask. And then ask that question, do the controls, I say, allow to people to fail safely? That's what we want to know. Here's a quick quality checklist. Now, I know Sarah's recording this, and this will be out to everyone, hopefully. It'll be available when Sarah posts it on the website. But make sure the scope of the risk assessment is detailed, right? If you're reading the risk assessment, don't just have they considered the scope, right? Were the right people in the room, right? Does the context support the risk? So do the people in the room know about the work sufficiently enough to give you to give you confidence that you can understand the risk, right? Make sure those worst case of credible scenarios are specific, plausible. Make sure they're correctly assessed, right? Do a spot check. If there's a lot there, do a spot check. Make sure the controls are specific to the risk and they're detailed, right? Make sure the improvement actions will reduce the level of risk and not focus just on administration. Respectfully challenge. Don't assume. Be vigilant. Acknowledge people make mistakes, right? If someone makes an error, what are we doing? As I said, demand innovation. Have a look at it. Strip out the admin controls. Strip out the the easy admin controls, the pieces of paper. What have you got left? If there's not much left, what are you doing? Right? Right? Do you have enough information to make that decision that this risk is tolerable? Do I accept the risk to me? Am I comfortable accepting responsibility for that risk that's left? And that about wraps it up, I think. I just want a quick plug. I've got a virtual public course, so we've got a bit of a masterclass on for facilitators and it's more along those lines of people that are facilitating semi-qualitative type risk assessments or bow ties or things like that. So if you're interested in that, just visit our website. But other than that, I think I'm done, Sarah.
Okay, we'll include that link. I've just emailed you about that for the masterclass in the email. So we have got a few questions from Tim. He has asked, what is a good example of risk scenario that is written well?
I think I gave you a couple there, Tim. It's just got to have that 4 ingredients. I like to see you've got to have that consequence, a specific consequence. So a worker crossing a road gets hit by a vehicle, resulting in a fatality. So we've got our target, we've got our interaction, we've got our hazard, the vehicle on the road, and we've got our consequence. So provided you've got those, they've just got to make sense, and they've especially just got to make sense to the people in the room that have been facilitated risk assessment.
Right, he did ask that very early on. Tanya asks, just a query, are you saying the Perform tool is good for assessing HMT or not because it doesn't capture everything else? I
actually think it's an excellent tool if used properly. I really like that Perform tool. It won't capture everything, but what it does do is it really highlights the specific hazards relating to that manual task, and it really it really drives it. It's a context-driven tool, and that's why I like it. So you might need to get some of that information and put it in like a rack type tool, or the typical spreadsheet type tool. But yeah, I think they did a pretty good job with it.
Okay, Mark has said that he's finding it very interesting, but he had to go. He asked about the recording. Would it be available on the OSHA website? No, I don't think we have any influence over OSHA in America.
I don't think I'd want anything on OSHA, would I? Anyway, that's a whole other argument.
We will be emailing it, but emails sometimes go to spam. So later today, check spam. Jake asks, how much quantitative data is too much? At what point does the data become the all and end all in risk assessments?
I think there's a real place for good it depends on how good the data is, right? So in terms of like HAZIDs or HAZOPs, like in terms of like particularly like process safety, where you might have an oxygen plant or some sort of chemical, and you're talking about data in terms of like blast radius and the people working in those. I think when we get to those sort of semi-qualitative risk assessments, I think that data is really good. Where it falls over is when they reducing the numbers of like how many people in a million have a fatality from actions, because that becomes then completely subjective, right? So if the data is really good, excellent, but good data then might need a different tool. So, that's where those HAZIDs or those really specific process safety style risk assessments become really important. But the data's got to be reliable, and it's got to be still dealt with in the context of the work being done.
All right. Declan asks, are we saying you can't really reduce the severity, only the probability of the event occurring?
Well, it's a bit of a mixed bag with this one. So if you write your risk scenario already with a predetermined consequence on it, well then, unless you eliminate the hazard or risk, that risk scenario is no longer valid, right? So, if we eliminate the hazard or the interaction, that risk scenario is not valid. Therefore, the consequence is not valid, right? So you can, if you eliminate that the task force, if you include consequence in your scenario, which is what I like to do. However, that being said, there are on occasions mitigating controls that you add in that could reduce the consequence. But you know, that doesn't happen often, but just be wary of it. That's all I'm saying. It can happen, but I've seen too often that those additional controls actually wouldn't reduce the credibility of the consequence. Therefore, you know, the people are just playing with numbers and playing with the matrix.
Okay, Joanne asks, what do you think of assessing risk control effectiveness? Is it useful?
It's the only thing that matters. If I was to assess, if like, to be quite frank, Joanne, I don't find risk matrices all that useful. What I do find useful is assessing the effectiveness of controls, right? Will they work? Are they working? Are they in place? How effective will they be? You know, what is their sources of failure? How will they fail? Doing all those things will really make a difference. And that the readings from the Minerals Council there, they'll go into that in some depth and really just have a look at that. But that's, to me, it's all about effective controls, right? Identify the risk, credible risk. Are your controls going to be effective? That's the number one.
Okay, so, and Joanne agrees with you. She said perfect.
Thanks, Joanne.
So too. So there's just a couple of chat items too where the questions have come in here. At the bottom, what are the clear distinctions between credible and reasonable scenario? Could you give an example?
Hang on, I just want to bring. Can I see the chat? Sorry, the chat is that.
It's 2 items away from the Q&A on the right, well, on my screen anyway.
Oh, okay. Oh, there it is. Okay, sorry, just so it helps me to read it. So what was the question you wanted to talk to?
The bottom one, what are the clear distinctions between credible and reasonable scenarios?
Well, there's no distinction between credible and it's got to be credible and reasonable, right? So, you know, if it's, and again, an example might be the old walking along a footpath, falling over and having a fatality. I don't think that's reasonable, and I don't think we should, you know, spend a lot of time or effort there. You know, like if someone could be walking on a walkway at work, you know, and the chances of that, if someone just falling over, tripping over the feet, yeah, that's a risk, right? But them then dying as a result of that, I don't think that's credible. So, well, to me, you know, it might not be credible, but it's hard to, credibility will be driven by the context of the work. And you'll only get that from talking to the people that are there that do that work all the time. So, it just needs to be reasonable. Like we don't want to, it's that too many what ifs I was talking about. Don't go down just to keep going down the what if rabbit hole, if that helps.
Right, and just from the chat, I won't read all of them, but just as the webinar was progressing, Adam said, yes, in my experience, scoring a risk to allow the job to go ahead is common. Some risk matrices are intentionally skewed to allow more things to fall into the tolerable range.
Yep.
And Daniel said, assumptions made is also an important piece of risk assessment information that is often not referred to.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, agree, Daniel. And that should be in your scope, right? Like if there's assumptions being made, they should be detailed in the scope so the manager can see what those assumptions are.
Right. And Rod said context involving the people I like to refer this as coalface management.
Yep.
And last one, Joanne's just said great session. But I think there is one more question, so I have to go back to that panel. Deepak has said, in my view, depending the controls, either severity or probability of both can be reduced. So it's more of like a comment.
Yep, just depends on how you write your risk scenario, Deepak.
Right. Okay. So we have no more questions and the timing is really great. And I'd like to thank you very much, Mark, for joining us once again. It's been really, really good.
Excellent. Feel free to reach out. Anyone, connect with me on LinkedIn, send me an email, give me a call. Happy to talk at any stage and have a discussion on this stuff.
All right. And we have got, we're arranging a lot of webinars, a lot of great topics coming up. There's a couple up on this link that I will just share in the chat and also later today. So please sign in and yeah, keep your eye out because there's a lot of good topics from a lot of really good people coming up. So thank you, Mark. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely day.
Nice.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.